Welcome to Under the Radar, a show about independent iOS app development. I'm Marco Arment.
And I'm David Smith. Under the Radar is never longer than 30 minutes, so let's get started.
So today we wanted to talk about kind of what we're calling the calm before the storm. Basically what to do and what to work on and what not to work on in the few months leading up to WWDC. Because the idea here is, you know, as iOS developers, or Mac developers, if any of you are listening, WWDC usually includes some kind of major changes, especially for iOS. Some kind of major API changes, possibly design changes, possibly business or marketing changes. So there's always a lot to do in response to what's announced at WWDC for the fall. And so the question is, right now as we record this, it's late April. And, WWDC is in mid-June. So it's close enough that, you don't necessarily want to get started on some kind of big project now, right before WWDC, or months before WWDC. And so the question is kind of what do you do in this quiet time? So, David, what do you do usually?
So I just got finished with Activity++, which was probably the last new app that I will launch before WWDC. And it was only launched when it was because 9.3 was new, had this new API, this new capability. Otherwise, this time of year tends to be a sort of a cleanup phase. I was thinking about this in preparation for the show of kind of what my normal year looks like, which is probably a good place to start in some ways, in many ways, my development year starts at WWDC on whatever Monday that is. This year, it's June 13th is essentially the new, developer New Year's, where at that point we will sort of have the roadmap of what's coming, what to expect, what's going to be important for the next year until the next WWDC.
And real New Year's, we also might have a hangover.
It's true. So from there, we have a few months of time until whatever's announced at WWDC actually gets released. So typically, recently, this has been in June. Everything's announced in September-ish, late September, early October, somewhere around there. Whenever the new iPhones come out, typically, is the sort of the window we have from when the new stuff is announced to when the new stuff is available. So it's usually a pretty busy time for most developers because, especially if it's a big sweeping change, it's think iOS 7 where it's all of this new UI stuff needs to be done, or those types of changes. Or it's with the watch, there's here's watchOS 2 that's going to be coming out. You have this very busy period essentially over the summer. And then you get all that out. Then you are, at least conceptually for me, my goal is then to get everything nice and tidy for the holidays. So I want to be it's not as pronounced of a bump as it used to be, but around Christmas, there's usually a nice solid bump in app downloads and sales and things because there's just a lot of people getting new devices, and people getting new devices seem to be more apt to go and download things. So you want to be sort of after the summer sort of intense phase, you have this cleanup phase, sort of running through Christmas, and then the early part of the year is when I tend to kind of look at it as it's a good opportunity for doing point releases, doing these kinds of big updates, but not massive change, not new apps typically. It's more just these big changes.
Right.
And then you get into this period right around now where I don't want to tackle anything that I don't think I'm going to finish by June. And I don't want to really make new small things because they may just become worthless or kind of deprecated or all these types of things in June. And so right now it tends to be more kind of a cleanup phase for me. So I'll look through, this is kind of the process I'm going through right now, is I'll look through my apps, of which there are many, and I will kind of see what are the little niggling things that I can do and things that have been on my to-do list for a while that overall would make the apps better. And these tend to be updates that are more quality of life updates, things that are just like making the app easier to use or better or more stable, that kind of thing, rather than like, I'm going to implement this whole new, radical approach to something. It's like, these are things that a lot of them the users won't see directly, or if they do, they'll just notice them that things are better rather than like totally different. But for me, that's kind of the cycle and what a year looks like. And so now is this kind of fun place where, I get to, it's a bit more experimental. Like I'm just going in and doing lots of tinkering, which is kind of nice, I guess. And it's like nice to kind of also rest a bit before the crazy sprint, or I guess marathon, that is June to September.
Oh yeah. I mean, I'm in pretty much complete agreement with everything you just said. In fact, you just covered basically my entire outline for this episode in 4 minutes. But
sorry.
But yeah, basically, like, this is a great time, as you just mentioned, for any kind of like administrative tasks, like you especially cleanup that is not like the code of your app necessarily. Administration stuff, changing, like updating your website or your marketing structure, some kind like that. If you want to like make a better site or play with certain kinds of advertising or whatever else, like this is a decent time to do that kind of stuff. And as you said, it's also a really good time to take vacations or to spend time with hobbies or with family or whatever else, because a lot of people take vacation stuff in the summertime, but because of the schedule that we are on, a lot of time developers can't take vacation or shouldn't take vacation in the summertime because summer is so busy for us tackling all the stuff that's going to be in the new version of iOS. And so this is a great time for all that. I mean, mainly, the main thing is what you don't want to be doing during this time, ideally, unless you really have to. But ideally, you don't want to be tackling major updates to existing apps. It's not a terrible time to write new apps, which we'll get to, with given certain parameters. But this is not a great time to do major updates to existing apps, because in June, when we get that WWDC Happy New Year Monday, and we start we see the State of the Unions and we start seeing some of the new APIs. What we usually find is that the new APIs that are released in June to developers and will be released in the fall to customers, usually they will make our jobs easier in some big ways in our code. And even if they won't necessarily make our jobs easier, they will at least make our jobs different. And so there's any amount of code that you write in the months before WWDC, it's kind of a liability that you might need, that everything you're writing now you might need to adapt or rewrite in a few months. There's always a liability of that when you're writing code, but here the timeline is so close that it's kind of not ideal. If you can avoid writing tons of new code or tons of adjustments to your app now, that's good. This is especially true. At least it used to be especially true if you're writing Swift, since Swift is still so young and changes so much. Although at least now with the open source roadmap, that should eliminate most of the surprises that are coming with Swift, and it's getting more mature. But in general, the ground will shift in June. So you don't want to build a whole bunch of new code on top of the old ground until you know what the shift will be. And then, maybe you can start taking advantage of new APIs. And it used to be the case that a lot of developers really couldn't take advantage of the new APIs yet because they had to support older versions of iOS. I think over time that need has diminished somewhat. It's certainly not gone, and certainly there are a lot of people who still need to support old versions of iOS. And if you do, then therefore, some of the ground shifting stuff might not apply to you yet. But I think most developers, especially most indie developers now, can get away with supporting just the current version of iOS, and the vast majority of their customers, in most cases, are okay with that because adoption rates are so good these days. So really, you want to avoid being incompatible or causing more work for yourself for the new stuff coming in the fall. And this applies not only to code, but also to design, marketing, business, because, design-wise, like there might be design changes to iOS. There's been rumors of more things related to True Tone and Night Shift, so maybe like a system-wide dark mode or something like that. You got to consider that. There might be design tweaks to the built-in widgets or to just the conventions. There might be new styles that are new navigation controller structures, like a split view kind of thing. New stuff like that might come out that might become like a new standard thing that people expect or want in the next version of iOS. So it is not like right now is not a good time to redesign your UI because you don't know what those changes will be yet. Also, marketing wise, there's considerations of like, do you want to do any kind of smaller, medium-sized releases now, and then also do like another medium-sized release in the fall? Or do you want to cluster them together and just wait, hold the stuff back now, and then in the fall do a bigger release? And of course, there's pluses and minuses to that as well. There's obviously more competition in the fall, but there's also more people looking, and there's chances to be featured, and we'll probably cover that at a later date. But also just it's worth considering that any assumptions you make now about the business of selling your app, however you're making money, whatever your structure is for collecting money from people or not, whether you're doing ads, whether you're doing upgrade payments, whatever you're doing, the business model that you have now might need to change once we learn what we're going to learn in June. So like, as you learned, David, like iAd is shutting down. So like if you were depending on iAd a couple months ago, well, now you have work to do. In June, there might be other changes announced. There might be changes to the App Store. There might be new policies where maybe what you're doing now won't be allowed anymore, or maybe it won't work as well anymore. And maybe there will be new things that we can do, new business models that become available or possible or more practical than they used to be. So this is all just a way to say like you should generally try to avoid any kind of major changes to existing apps during this time period because you might have to change it all again in 2 months.
Yeah, and I think there's, in general, it's like a lot of this speaks to a more fundamental thing that I know is important, like an important thing for me to learn in sort of the discipline of app creation was rather than just, as it's so easy to do, like just keep barreling ahead on like opening up Xcode every morning and just getting in there and writing the codes and whatever you think of building, is trying to instead make sure that you're being thoughtful about it and like being somewhat disciplined about it. Because when I think about these types of like considerations for getting ready for June, is a lot of what I'm trying to do is make sure that I'm setting myself up so that on June 14th, I am ready to dive headlong into whatever is announced. And I may or may not, like maybe what they announce isn't really relevant to me or my app, or maybe it's just not that interesting, whatever it is. But what I want is to make sure that I'm ready to do that and like I'm poised and capable of doing that. Like what I don't want to do is to just like have been barreling along doing something that's like creating all of these sort of responsibilities or commitments that I'm going to then have to be responsible for in June, July, and August. Like that's where it would become very problematic. And so I need to think about it and like look, it's a struggle I know for myself that when I used to work in a more corporate environment, there was a certain amount of structure imposed on me by like having a manager and my manager having a manager and so on. And we'd have to go through things like sprint planning and we work out, what are we going to work on for the next 2 weeks? And go through all these exercises that in a corporate environment are kind of just the way you manage larger teams. But when you're working for yourself or with a very small team, that discipline has to come from yourself. And so you have to look at these things and say, well, like I would love to add this feature to this app, or I'd love to implement this new thing, or do or whatever that activity is you want to do. There's a certain amount of actually having to look at it and say, there's, I think, 44 days till WWDC. Like, can I get this done in then? And if I do, is that going to set me up to be free and available afterwards? Or is it the kind of thing that's like, there's this big experimental thing that I'm working on that I'm going to release, and I'm going to expect to have to do a ton of customer support or management of it, or like I'm creating this thing that's going to then require a lot of my time down the road? Like those types of considerations, the only person who's going to be doing those is like me. I can't rely on someone else to come in and say, this is what you need to work on for the next month in the run-up. And so I have to have that discipline myself to look at it and say, yeah, I think I can get this done. Like the things that I'm working on for myself are these sort of small improvements to all my apps that I kind of had these list of things, and they're just like these small improvements. Most of them are probably like a week's worth of work, and all of them are things that I think won't require maintenance in June or, sort of the follow-up. They're very self-contained and neat and tidy. And that's by choice and intention. I'm not really the kind of person, it's not like I have a Gantt chart, like this big organizational thing that I'm like, okay, well, I'll do this, and this task is dependent on this task. And so like, that's not what I'm saying. And I don't know, some people love Gantt charts. They don't really work for me in the way I had to think about things. But having that kind of discipline of at least thinking about it consciously and saying, like, am I realistically going to be done with all these things so that I'm poised and ready when the new stuff and the new opportunities appear? Because ultimately, that's all this comes down to is like, there's going to be new opportunities because there'll be change. Am I going to be in a position to set myself up to take advantage of those opportunities? Because like, that's most of what, like, being lucky in a lot of these types of arenas where you look at somebody, it's like, oh man, it's like they really lucked out and that's why their business is a success. It's like maybe, or they were just ready and prepared for when the opportunity presented itself so that they could dive in head first. It's probably more that.
Usually some of both.
A little bit of both. But you can't do if you don't have the one, the other one's not going to really matter nearly as much.
That's true. All right, so we are sponsored this week, once again, by our friends at Pingdom. You can start monitoring your websites and servers today at pingdom.com with a free 14-day trial. When you enter offer code RADAR at checkout, you get 20% off your first invoice. Now, Pingdom is a web monitoring service, and I said last time that I've been using Pingdom for a long time, a very long time. Today, I actually looked up how long exactly it was that we used Pingdom, and so I found the very first email I got from David Karp when we were both making Tumblr from April 2nd, 2007. And he says, I think I'm going to sign us up for this. And then message body, pingdom.com. And sure enough, he did sign up for it. And so that we've been using Pingdom, first me and that David, now me and this David. We've been using Pingdom for a very long time. I've been using it personally since spring of 2007, so for 9 years now. And Pingdom is great for monitoring your websites and web services. Anything you can monitor through a basic HTTP access of some kind, Pingdom can monitor that. And so this is useful for, of course, making sure your website is up, making sure your service is up, but you can also do things like monitor for changes. So you can do things like monitor somebody else's website. Like we mentioned last time, we would monitor the WWDC website to see when WWDC was announced each year, which mattered a lot, especially back when it was like first come, first serve for tickets. And so you can monitor any site you want for changes. You can monitor your own sites for uptime, and you can also monitor anything that you can represent by like a kind of like a binary like good or bad status. So, for instance, if you have some kind of health page or health check for your apps, your services, you can have the health check return a different string, and then you can have Pingdom search for that string on the page, so that when things are not just not even down, but when things are just not ideal, like one of your servers is running low on disk space or something like that, you can be alerted of that with a separate check, and you can have different alert levels. You can say, all right, well, if a server is low on disk space, email me about that, but I don't need to be like texted or notified with tons of alarms about that. But if the whole website is down, set everything on fire and let me know. Like, do whatever it takes to notify me that the website is down. And there's so many customization options with Pingdom. It's a great service. They're widely used now. They say they detect around 13 million outages every month, which is over 400,000 outages every day. So you can really do a lot with Pingdom, and a lot of people do, and I've been doing it myself for 9 years now. So check it out, pingdom.com. You need to be the first one to know when your website or service is down, not everybody else. So you need to know first. Go to pingdom.com for a 14-day free trial and 20% off when you enter the offer code RADAR at checkout. Thank you very much to Pingdom for sponsoring our show once again. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, I think we both kind of agreed that this is a good time for cleanup and minor improvements of our apps. I want to go a little bit more into what that is, what that means. I've been doing a lot of this myself with Overcast recently. In the last couple of months, I've integrated analytics. I've integrated what used to be called Crashlytics and is now called Fabric, which is owned by Twitter. That whole thing integrated analytics and crash reporting more deeply into the app. Before I was for a while I was using Hockey, then I was using Apple's built-in stuff, and now I found Fabric to be a good combo for me. And the main reason why is that I really wanted to take this time to improve quality. And so this is a great time to, minimize crashes, to go through and fix like little bugs like that, just little bugs, little annoyances to your users, anything that causes crashing or failures. This is a great time to do that because like that's the kind of stuff that generally like whatever's announced at WWDC is probably not going to affect that kind of code. It's also a good time to pay off any kind of low-level technical debt, as long as it's not a ton of work and will cause tons of bugs. But any kind of like if you have like technical debt like in your sync or data layers, this is a good time to pay that off if you can, and to do like minor feature experimentation. Like if you want to tweak like small changes to the app, not any kind of big overreaching change or redesign, but if you just want to tweak small changes, this is a good time to do that as well. It's also a good time to solicit or investigate customer feedback about what kinds of things you want to be doing this summer. So ask your existing customers or look at your analytics or implement analytics of some kind. Don't be creepy, but implement some kind of analytics to say like, what should I be thinking about this summer when all this stuff is announced? What should I have on my roadmap feature-wise for my app? What are my customers really asking for? How is the app actually being used and not being used? This is a great time for all that stuff. And basically everything that isn't massive code, design, or business changes. This is a great time for all those things. And so me personally, I have, as I mentioned, integrated Crashlytics and Fabric and analytics there. And so I've taken this time to drop my crash rate to nearly zero. And through the combination of the last few versions, plus the version that I just submitted this morning, just a whole bunch of minor updates focused on getting the crashes reduced as low as I possibly can. Just trying to eliminate, like Crashlytics tells you like a crash-free users percentage, which is kind of cool. It's kind of cool metric. And it used to be like 99 point something low. Now it's 99.9, and the new version I have in review now should raise that even higher. It's just a very satisfying like kind of technical debt payoff period I'm going through here, where just like, let me just fix as much as I possibly can that I can fit in this time span. And then it's a great time to do any kind of experimentation with other things that are not your app, that are not like the code of your app. So, I mentioned experimental, small features or small changes, but this is actually a great time to step away from your iOS apps and to look at larger kinds of experimentation. So things like learning a new language, learning a new API, just learning something new that will probably not change dramatically in June. So, other languages, non-Apple platforms, things like that. And also just making new apps on different platforms. So if you've wanted for a long time to make an Android app or a web app, maybe arguably even a Mac app, which I'm kind of been playing with a little bit, because the Mac doesn't change that much usually at WWDC, so maybe a Mac app would also qualify here. But any kind of app on different platforms, this is a great time to experiment with that, because that's probably not going to change much in June, doesn't really matter, and you kind of have to like save your iOS juices for then, And it's also a great time to just enter an entirely new business if you wanted to like start a podcast, start a blog, start selling t-shirts or something. Like if you wanted to start something new that is not an app that won't necessarily take up your entire life, this is a good time to experiment with that as well. So basically it's a time for experimentation of all kinds, as long as it's not going to be a problem come June.
Exactly. And I think there's also something to be said for, knowing me, I'll probably pull a chart for this after the show, but I'm like, I imagine the number of new submissions this time of year is lower than the typical like seasonal rate. And so if you have something that you've been thinking about launching, like a small little project or something, like there's a certain amount of wisdom in launching it at a time when things are quieter, when there's less going on, when in general, like there's not a whole lot of tech news that's come out. Like we're kind of in this quiet bit between the spring announcements and the summer announcements. And so if you have something that you have been working on, there's certainly some advantage to pushing to make sure that you get it out in the quiet time, that's now. Because if you try and do it over the summer, there's going to be a lot more competition on the news side. And if you try and do it in the fall, then you're going to have a lot of competition just on the competing apps side. Like there's just a lot of new apps, a lot of big updates. If you think about things like the featured page in the App Store, like there in the fall, it's going to be full of like the apps that take advantage of the new stuff. Like last fall, it was like, hey, here's all the apps that are updated for 3D Touch, or things like that. Like Apple tends to push those types of things, but I can't think of, like, there's not a lot of huge, big, sweeping things right now that would kind of push something out. And so there's certainly an incentive to, if you've been working on something and you might be able to get it out, this is a pretty good time. I can tell from, launching Activity Plus a couple weeks ago that it was easier in some ways to get attention for something around now. And, if you just think about the volume of tech news, like if you just, if you're this kind of person who keeps up on tech news, like it's a quietish time right now because Apple is probably not going to be announcing much new because they'll save that for June. And a lot of the big organizations that, create tech news, they're in that same kind of cycle that they have their big events in the summer, or around then, and that's when they'll be doing it. So there's some advantage to doing that too, like just taking advantage of it as a quiet time to maybe get a bit more attention for yourself.
Yeah, totally. Because that's, as you mentioned, like there really isn't a lot else going on for the most part right now. So if you have something where you don't necessarily need to wait until WWDC, so if it's a small app or something that doesn't really rely too heavily on the frameworks and the platform staying identical, and things that might include things like games. We don't know anything about games for the most part, but that might include things like games where like you're not usually using most of the platform APIs for games. Usually you're using like OpenGL or more likely some kind of higher level cross-platform game engine and doing all your custom coding in there, and you're not really using like UIKit directly for most stuff and things like that. So like, that games and everything we just said might be totally invalid. We really have no idea. But this is a good time for like things that will not likely be strongly affected by WWDC happening.
Yeah. And the last thing I wanted to mention too is if you are going to be at WWDC, something else you should be doing in this time is preparing yourself for it in terms of keeping an eye and a list and a checklist of like the things that you are going to the conference to get answered. Like I have a list in my task management system that's just like WWDC questions. And anytime between now and WWDC that I encounter something that I'm thinking like, hey, maybe this would be a good introductory question to ask an Apple engineer, it just goes in there, and I'll just try and keep track of these things. And a lot of them, it's probably good to like say they don't have to be amazing questions, like these groundbreaking novel concepts. Think of them as icebreakers. Like it's so much easier to get a conversation going if you are able to go to a lab at WWDC, if you have, something like a jumping off point that you can start from. And so just be thinking about that so that rather than, the morning of the Tuesday of WWDC, you go into the lab and you're like, what would I like to know? Like, it's going to be a harder thing to think of the things versus now when you're kind of in the thick of it, in your code, running into little issues, running into little gotchas, things that would be helpful to, talk to someone at Apple about. And if it would be relevant, always good to file a radar about them and have that number with you when you go to WWDC. It just avoids the dance that you'll end up doing otherwise with an Apple engineer. We're like, oh, have you filed a radar about this? And they say no. And it's like, well, you should probably do that. And that it's kind of a conversation killer versus if you can go in and say like, yes, I did. Here's the number. And then you can continue the conversation from there. So just a little tip that I've found very helpful for myself to get ready for WWDC every year.
Sounds good. And with that, I think we're out of time this week. So thank you, everybody, for listening. Good luck with your technical debt and experimental period that we're entering now. And I hope you listen next week. Thanks a lot for listening, and we'll see you then.
Bye.